I love to point this out to people who criticize Genesis or origins by saying, oh, Genesis, it's just scientifically inaccurate, blah, 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 blah. My first question is, why would you criticize the Bible, Genesis, for not being something it was never intended to be? Can you, explain that to me? Can you explain why that's at all coherent? If you can make sense of that argument to me, then we can have a discussion. Because if you can't, then your argument is totally worthless. I mean, let's go at it from some other angle. Let's take it for what it is, because what it's really saying is that there was a creation event. God is responsible, the God of the Bible. Okay, can science disprove that? You can hate it all you want. Let's say Isaiah kicks the bucket. Now what do? Hey, the master's dead. What do we do? Hey, okay, here's what we do. You get all your stuff together, everything you wrote down, all the sermons and everything, we got to collect it because we know it's from God. We've got to hand it to posterity. We've got to get it together so it's not lost. So everybody brings their notes. And now what does the leader do now? Okay, put them on a pile right here. Got all the scrolls here or whatever on a pile. He shuffles them, makes sure the sides are even, and says, anybody got a stapler? Now you could just as well say, and trust me, some do, well, it didn't have vowels to begin with, so we should put ba, reshit in there and be definite in the beginning. First creative act. Sure, you can say that. The only problem is you don't have a single manuscript that does have vowels that has that. 0. And I bring that up because it's something to store away in your mind, because we're fond, as evangelicals, we're fond of saying things like, oh, those Hebrew scribes were so good at what they did. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that 99.9% accuracy in transmission and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, they do. Hebrew scribes didn't lose their brains in the Middle Ages. Okay, they're just as good then as they were at the time of Qumran. So it's cheating to just say, well, I like that other vowel better. And I can have that because it's not original. Yeah, you can. But there is no tradition that supports it. And that's what we have for the Hebrew Bible. We have scribal tradition for the way it's vocalized. So let's go back here. We got two possible translations. If we opt for the when translation, now look, I've changed the colors. Now we have dependent clauses. We don't have a series of independent ideas. We have two full verses of clauses that are leading up to something. And that something is verse 3, and that is the main idea. That's the independent thought. So here, just think about it. Read along with me or in your mind, and just think about how it sounds. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, now the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. It really has a different feel. It sounds like everything in verses 1 and 2 are just prep. They're not really happening. They're the writer describing what conditions, now catch this, the writer is describing conditions that already exist before God actually creates anything, before God actually speaks anything into existence. In other words, you have a situation where verses 1 and 2 lead to verse 3, and they set it up. The first creative act, the first thing God does in Genesis 1 through 3, in this view, is not verse 1. It's verse 3. That's the very first thing that God speaks into existence. For lack of a better term, I couldn't think of anything that's very witty or alliterated. I put Hebrew syntax view, because this is strict Hebrew syntax. Syntax is sentence structure, sentence relationships. If you're going to just go by what the Hebrew says like a zealot, strictly, obeying the rules of Hebrew grammar, that is what you get. And that's why some English Bibles have that. The new RSV, I wish I would have put this up, the new RSV kind of combines them. It says something like, in the beginning when God created, I mean, it merges them together. So it's like, hey, we can please everybody here. It's kind of an interesting tactic, but, translators have to, especially with this verse, they're sensitive because we have this verse, like verses like John 3:16, we got this one in our heads. And so to render it really differently, that might, bother some people. The JPS, Jewish Publication Society, didn't really care about that. What's the importance? Again, another way of looking at the information is that the traditional view has a chronological sequence. God's first creative act is in verse 1. He creates everything. Verse 2, that's the result. That's what we get. Verse 3, God says, okay, back to work. Let there be light. The other view says, well, let me tell you a story. When God began to create the heavens and the earth, and, now when he got on the job site, the earth was already formless and empty. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, time to get to work. Let there be light. It's a completely different feel. If you take the alternate view, it allows these assertions about what's happening in Genesis 1:1 through 3. Genesis 1:1 is not the absolute beginning. And Genesis 1:1 through 3 describes an ordering or a fashioning, doing something with matter that already existed. And that, of course, raises what obvious question? Well, where'd that come from? Yeah, if something's already there, who put that there? Okay, and why do we ask that question? I can tell you right now, a Semite, an ancient Israelite, would have looked at you, in this case it's my wife, and said, what are you talking about? Who cares? What a pointless question. We ask that question why? Because we're moderns and we're thinking scientifically. We've got to account for that. I've got to account for that pre-existing matter. What do I do? What do I do? I got to ask that question because, scientifically we know that matter isn't just there. I mean, it's got to start from, that's what's going through our heads because we have both the benefit and the curse of modern scientific thinking. Okay, different things are firing in our heads than, an ancient Israelite would have kind of given you a blank stare. And we'll talk about why he would give you a blank stare in the next couple of weeks. Let's go back to Bara. Well, doesn't Bara settle this? I mean, Bara is in verse 1. And that has to mean creation out of nothing. So that solves it. That takes care of the ambiguity. End of story. Sit down, Mike. Okay, end of story. It's all settled with Bara. Oh, if only it were that easy. If only it were that easy. Bara does not inherently mean creation from nothing. And I'm going to show you that if you insist on that, be prepared for a contradiction in your Bible between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, you may like contradictions in the Bible. I'm willing almost to say that's not a sin. You may like that or not be troubled by it at all. I don't like contradictions in the Bible. Not only do I have theological problems with it, but my mind just doesn't like stuff like that. I've got to kind of settle it somewhere, somehow. But I can live with ambiguity. I just don't want contradiction. Ambiguity and contradiction are two entirely different things. Okay? Let me show you a few things. We'll go to, we're going to work here. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Right down here, I'm going to click on the word created. And I hope you can see the highlighting. Or you probably can't. But created right here is the word barah. You can see it in the right-hand pane. So we have God's, announces to his heavenly host. That's how I take Genesis 1:26. It says, I got a great idea. Let's make humankind in our image and in our likeness. And so verse 27, God gets down to business and God barahs humankind in his own image. Now here's a question. I want to say it's not a trick question, but it kind of is. Okay. Can bara mean creation out of nothing here? Yeah. Either, in this case. Was humankind created out of nothing? That's correct. Genesis 2:7. Here, I'll answer the question. We go down to chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground. Adam didn't get here being created out of nothing. Did Eve? No. In verse 22, Eve is created from a portion of Adam's side. So in both cases, God is using material that was already there, dust, Adam's side, to create humankind. Now that should tell us, we go back up here. Am I going the right direction? No, I'm not. Okay. Let's just scroll. Do it quickly. We go back up to verse 27. God created man in his own image. Bara here cannot mean creation out of nothing. This is why I cautioned you. If you're going to insist that this word has to be understood as creation out of nothing, you got a real problem here. You've got two creation accounts that are diametrically opposed, and you can say, well, they might be from two sources, and I'm not hostile to two traditions that someone put together. I'm not hostile to that. What I am hostile to is you can't have it either way or both ways. You can't have one that says absolutely God didn't use anything to create humanity, and the other one says he did. Okay, that's clearly contradictory. The solution is very simple. Just admit that bara doesn't have to mean creation out of nothing. Now, it might somewhere. Okay, and of course, our minds go back to Genesis 1:1. Does it mean creation out of nothing there? Well, again, if you take the second view of the clauses, you would say it doesn't mean creation out of nothing there either, because God isn't creating in verse 1. That's set up to verse 3. And you don't have a contradiction there if you take that view, but you do have the idea that God doesn't start doing what he's doing until verse 3. Now, the other verse I had here is Exodus 20, verse 11. If we go back to our interlinear here, in Genesis 2:7, I should just click there probably. Quicker just to do that. In Genesis 2:7, we have the Lord God formed. That's a word, yatsar. In Genesis 1:26, let us make, that's a third word, a third verb, asa, for what God's doing. Humankind, the creation of humankind is actually described with three verbs, bara, yatsar, and asa. That tells you that they all overlap in meaning. And in Exodus 20:11, guess what is asa? Made. The very word we have here for make, and we find out that humankind is made, is formed from pre-existing material. Guess what is made, not barad, in Exodus 20:11? The heavens and the earth. Okay, let's look it up. Let's go there real quickly. This is the Ten Commandments chapter. For in 6 days the Lord made, right here, asa. It's not bara. Now I look at this and say, well, that's interesting, big deal, because they're synonyms. It is a big deal if you want to say that bara has to mean a certain thing. Creation out of nothing. It doesn't, and so this issue doesn't solve anything. But the meaning of bara does not get you anywhere when it comes to, well, which flow of the verses is correct? Is it the traditional view where God's first creative act is in verse 1, or is it this Hebrew syntax view where God's first creative act is in verse 3? Bara doesn't help you with that. Yom doesn't help you either. Now, the argument goes that Yom in Genesis 1 has to mean 24-hour days because it's grouped with a numeral. Any of you who have spent much time reading about Genesis are familiar with this argument. Yom by itself can mean an assortment of things. In fact, if you go back to Genesis, we just read it back in Genesis 2. Let's just go here. I'll type it in there. Okay. Let's go up a little bit. All right. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. By the way, let's click on that. When they were barad, in the day the Lord God made asa. See, they overlap. In the day that God made the earth and the heavens. Like, did God do everything in one day? One 24-hour cycle? Well, no. In this case, Yom refers back to the previous 6 days. It's more than 24 hours. Now, you can go through the Old Testament and look for Yom till your mind is numb. And yes, I've done that. You can do that. Don't try this at home. And you'll find that Yom can mean a 24-hour cycle. It can mean a long, long time, like the day of the Lord, even future time. It can mean, some indefinite period. It usually means daytime. In other words, they meant the same thing by it that we do when we say day. Okay, pick up anything. Chances are when you see the word day in a newspaper or something like that, it's referring to daytime, when the sun's out. That's usually what it means. When it's grouped with a number, it doesn't really help. I'll give you a couple instances here where you have the exact same phenomenon you get in Genesis 1, Yom plus a number. This is Jacob and Laban, that whole incident. He took his kinsman with him and pursued him. Laban is pursuing Jacob. Pursued him for 7 days. And followed close after him. Now, do you really want to press the point that Laban and his men traveled for 7 consecutive 24-hour cycles without stopping? That's absurd. They traveled 7 times when it was daytime, 7 days. Right? That's what you would do. You wouldn't ride during the night, and you certainly wouldn't try to go for 7 in a row. It's not like they're trying to get some record or something. It's not like the Great Chase or whatever that show is. Great Race. Here's another one. Jacob and Esau, when they finally get reunited, Jacob said to him, Esau says, hey, why don't you come over to my place? And Esau says that to Jacob. Jacob doesn't really want to do that. Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are frail and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they're driven hard for 1 day, all the flocks will die. Now, what's he saying? If you drive them for 24 hours, they're probably going to die. 20, 21, we can probably make that. No, he's saying daytime. He's not thinking like we are. Okay, 24-hour units. He's thinking, well, this is when you travel. It's day. If we do this for 1 more day, because we've been on the run for quite a while, they're going to die. So he doesn't want to do that. Now, the traditional view I don't want you to go away thinking that there's nothing to the traditional view, because you do have the slim possibility of the vowel. The vowel is Masoretic, it's medieval. You also have a few other considerations. Okay, what about, the material? Again, if I'm going to try to argue in the next couple weeks, my personal view is that Genesis has nothing to do with science at all. It was completely, the questions we ask of it, the things we're concerned about, wouldn't have even popped into the mind of an ancient Israelite at all. Genesis is really about theological messaging. Now, I'm going to show you some very specifics, because there are things that are happening in Genesis that are direct slaps in the face of certain ideas in the ancient world associated with other deities who claimed that their god or gods were the creator. And there are little things in the text that say, no. You're wrong. You're like really wrong. You don't have a prayer, pardon the pun, of being right, okay? It's theological messaging. They're not concerned with, they're not Darwinists. They're not post-Darwinists. They don't know anything about the questions that are in our minds. And I love to point this out to people who criticize Genesis or origins by saying, oh, Genesis, it's just scientifically inaccurate, blah, 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 blah. My first question is, why would you criticize the Bible, Genesis, for not being something it was never intended to be? Can you, explain that to me? Can you explain why that's at all coherent? That's like me criticizing my boy for not being a girl. Okay? It was never intended. I mean, this is what he is. He's not that, so I'm not going to... You're criticizing the Bible for not being something it isn't, and it wasn't supposed to be. If you can make sense of that argument to me, then we can have a discussion. Because if you can't, then your argument is totally worthless. I mean, let's go at it from some other angle. Let's take it for what it is, because what it's really saying is that there was a creation event. God is responsible, the God of the Bible. Okay, can science disprove that? You can hate it all you want. Okay, but there's no way to empirically defeat it, and I know that, and most atheists who've been around the block get that as well. They're going to argue with you about something else. And it's usually the character of the book. But I actually enjoy that, because I want you to justify the stupidity of your assertion. And I don't say that, but that's what I'm after. That's what I want from you. Justify the stupidity of the question you just asked me. And then we can talk. Right? You're going back to the traditional view, though. If this is something, I realize it took a while. It was really when I learned Hebrew that I learned, oh boy, we got something else going on here. There's one possibility, and that is Isaiah 40:21. This would be the way I think you could possibly defend the traditional view. It says, do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Notice the phrase, from the beginning. Guess what? There's no definite article at beginning, just like in Genesis 1. And you look at the verse, and we sort of intuitively know that Isaiah's talking about Genesis 1, isn't he? Would there be some other beginning in Isaiah's head besides the one in Genesis 1? Well, I can't really think of any other beginning Isaiah would have in mind, so it's possible to argue that despite the syntax, despite the grammar, Isaiah looked at Genesis 1:1 as the beginning. It's possible. You could also say he's looking at Genesis 1:1 and thinking of it the way the Hebrew syntax view would think of it, the whole series of events. There's ambiguity here. So the traditional view, my own view is that it's not supported the most easily, but it is possible. Okay, but you need Isaiah 40 to come along and help you. Now we have a few questions, or a few minutes. I'd be glad to take any questions, but let me just prep by saying the rest of the weeks by saying this. If you look at Genesis, again, the one thing I wanted you to get is to understand why guys like Bruce Waltke, why Hebrew scholars, who cares about the days? Who cares about the time sequences? Who cares about, the long eons and the millions of, this is why they don't care. Because if you have indefinite time going on in the first two verses, let's just go back. If you have indefinite time, and the creation really only starts in verse 3, and the writer presupposes that, there was stuff there, yeah, we'll give God credit for it, but we have no time sequence before verse 3. You could very easily argue, sure, once creation starts, once verse 3 starts, you got 6 24-hour days, you got a Sabbath day, great. But you got eons of time before that because there was something there already. That's why they don't care. It's very easy to mount that defense and just leave it there. And many Old Testament scholars do. Okay, I wanted you to realize what the thinking is. And I also, again, because I'll bring it up in the next 3 weeks, there is great value in pointing out to people exactly what the text says and asking them to defend their idea and letting the Bible be what it is. It's about who's God and who's creator. Doesn't mean it says anything wrong in these other areas. I mean, ancient people, Dax brought up an example, was it a week ago, about the humors and some other things. I'll show you a few examples where the one you brought up is the notion that the seat of our emotions and our intellect and our will is our intestines, according to the Bible. Well, no, it's not. In fact, you won't even see it. There is no Hebrew word for brain in the Old Testament. They don't know anything about brain science at all. Okay, they knew by experience that when they were uptight about something, or they could feel it. Now, we know that there's a reason for that because this is connected to, like everything else, because of this thing we call the nervous system. Okay, we know that. They didn't, but they could experience this. There's nothing going off like in their head, bodily signals, like it is in your gut. You all know what I'm talking about. So that's a very natural thing to presume. It's completely pre-scientific. It's a presumption. The issue is, can someone's presumption still be very useful to communicating things that are absolutely true? Even if the presumption is flawed, does it really have anything to do with truth claims? And I'm going to suggest to you that it doesn't. Okay? I'm not going to tip my hand with any illustrations here. But there are things about Genesis that are in that territory. And I think it's very useful, again, for insisting that people, if you want to pick on it, if you want to attack my Bible, you need to begin by letting it be what it is. Don't erect your straw man. Don't tell me what you think it is and then shoot at it when it's not. Okay, because it's not hard to destroy that. Let's take the King James. The King James is a very good translation. It is by no means perfect. I can say this because I've literally been through every syllable of the translation, comparing it to the Hebrew, because Dale wanted it done. That was one of my jobs a couple of years, and I enjoyed it because I felt like I owed something to the King James. I was sort of raised on that. And it's a very good translation, but you can tell that there are uneven levels of ability in a translator, where some just have an appreciation for this thing going on that others don't, even within a translation, because the King James was a committee translation. So, and when it came out in the beginning, I don't think it's a cosmological statement situated in the history of science for what was going on at the time. I don't think they're thinking of that. I think they're just doing the best they can. And logically in their mind, they're thinking, well, what other beginning would there be? And it just makes more sense this way. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. But once that's sort of canonized as a translation, it becomes something that you're really hesitant to change. I mean, you can change like 1,000 other things in Genesis, but it's like that one verse. Everybody knows that one. So we don't want to, fiddle with that one. Translators do make, and I hate this word in this context, but they do make compromises like that. So I think it's just the result of familiarity and in that case, a real desire for consistency. Some of the newer translations like NRSV, they're sort of losing that predilection to preserve that, getting away from it a little bit. I think we need to realize that Bible study is really not Bible reading. Okay, Bible study takes work. It takes thinking, about the text. And a lot of what you saw me do tonight, you could do with English if you just ask the right questions. If you compare translations, because you'll run into like, if you run into the JPS Torah, you're going to go, when God began to create, what in the world are they thinking there? Is that possible? Is that for real translation? I mean, it got published. It's a real publisher. It's not like something on the internet that, and they're Jewish, they should know what they're doing here a little bit, If you compare translations, and there really is no substitute for thinking about what you're reading. Thinking about it, spending real time. And I'm going to use the C word here, reading it critically. Okay, just because you ask a question about the text doesn't mean that God is offended. You don't need to go repent for that, okay? God expects you to use the brain power that he's given you to think about what he's dispensed, what he providentially has preserved for you to read. It's the Berean thing, going on. I mean, it's not just about reading, it's about thinking, lingering over it and really thinking. And if you have good tools, again, to compare things, you can go a long way if you're just willing to put in the seat time and expose yourself to different sources, different thinkers, different preachers that just get you stimulated, to think. It's a never-ending process. I mean, to me, it's an endless fascination. My wife can bear witness to the fact that she pretty much sees the back of my head most of the time when I'm at home. And I'm usually doing something, related to this because it just becomes, it's just an endless fascination. And all the getting into the languages, it's not all that it does for you, but the set of questions you have become different because you're paying attention to different things. One of the best things, I'll leave with this tip, use an interlinear. Okay, I would recommend learning the alphabet using the interlinear for one reason only. It slows you down. It forces you to read slowly. We often, because we're English sight readers, we just whip through content. We just whip right through it. And we miss a lot of what's going on there. If you just slow down, it'll do wonders for you.